Gosh, this chair is so creaky. Dave Chappelle is a comedy legend. I remember hearing people say that everybody was upset at the trans jokes that he'd made in the original few specials, and honestly, looking back at them, they're really not that bad. I mean, they may be a little bit off the mark in terminology, but he's not trying to hurt anybody.
The difference between her and the trans is I believe transgenders. I don't understand them either, but I know they mean what they say. Then they cut their dicks off. That's all the proof I need.
Even after I learned more about the trans community, I still didn't really see a problem with the jokes. And then they released the closer. There are two things that I want to address before I start this video. I often hear people say that Dave Chappelle's being taken out of context. I encourage you to go watch the special so you can make sure that what I'm doing here is not the case. And the second thing, calling something a joke does not exempt it from criticism. Jokes can be funny without sending a harmful message, and jokes can absolutely be used to send harmful messages. They don't have an untouchable status above every kind of language. What I'm going to be examining in this video is specifically the message that the joke is trying to send, and I hope you understand that that's not me trying to censor any form of comedy. Just keep these in mind moving forward. For a long time, I subscribed to a particular belief system that I feel like is shared with a lot of my fellow Americans. I didn't necessarily mind trans people. I thought them a bit strange, but, I didn't really know many because I was a good old Southern boy. I certainly didn't want to bring them any harm. I thought that any consenting adult can do what they want with their own body. Hell, I'm even fine with using their preferred pronouns. But I also didn't believe that it was possible to change your gender. I mean, trans people can do what they want with their own body, but I'm not obligated to agree with everything they say. That doesn't mean I'm obligated to agree with everything they say. These attitudes definitely seem harmless, right? We've kind of been implicitly taught since birth that the only thing you needed to distinguish between the two genders, and they're often conflated with sex, was whether you got a juice box or a ding-dong. So when you see somebody with enough piercings to set up a metal detector at Area 51, and they tell you that not only are gender and sex different, but that gender is a social construct, Noah, get the boat. You may have heard of something called the gender binary. You may even have the impression that this is what is recognized by the biological scientific community. I often hear people say that gender and sex are essentially the same thing, or at least they were until recently. And if you believe that, I genuinely understand. Even as I started to move more to the left, I still disagreed with this concept. Multiple societies throughout human history have had more than two genders. India, for example, has a third gender called a Hijra, which has actually been a part of their culture for over 4,000 years. Many Native American tribes recognize separate genders, kind of referred to as a blanket term as two-spirit people. Native Hawaiians also have a third gender called Mahu. The list goes on. The gender binary as we recognize it today is largely a product of Western society and its imperialized territories. And even then, in Western cultures, there are what we would call transgender people, dating all the way back to the Roman Empire. You could just say that all of that is irrelevant though, right? I mean, there are ancient societies. They probably had different concepts of a lot of things, and gender is no exception. But to essentially boil it all down, sex is based purely on biological characteristics, whereas gender is a set of characteristics with social presentation. If you think gender isn't completely based off of social presentation, I'm gonna run a little experiment for you. I'm gonna show you some pictures of some men here, and of these men, I want you to identify which one is the trans man. Okay, well, if you guessed the first one, you'd be correct. If you guessed the second one, then you'd also be correct because they're all trans. They're all trans. Now I'm going to show you some pictures of women, and don't worry, only one of them is trans. So I want you to guess which one of these is a trans woman. If you guessed the second one, you'd be correct because they're all trans. I lied. They're all trans. And okay, this might not be convincing to you because how somebody looks doesn't necessarily dictate what their biological functions are. Some people would even go as far as to say that trans people are just cosplaying the opposite sex.
They look at trans women the way we blacks might look at blackface. It offends them. Like, ooh, this bitch is doing an impression of me.
Binary means two. There are two sexes. So how can somebody just change their sex? And you're right. Trans people can't change their sex. But they're also not claiming to, hence why they're called transgender and no longer called transsexual. And the thing is, by the way, sex actually isn't a binary, it's bimodal. Okay, so let's say this is the spectrum of the sexes, right? The far right here being the most feminine that one can possibly be. Like, for example, Stacy's mom, who, as we all know, has got it going on. And on the far left here, we have the absolute chaddest of chads, just big voluptuous pectorals and a whopping baloney pony that'll get you stopped by the TSA at the airport. This would be the distribution of characteristics by the population size. Most biological women arrive somewhere around the middle of this peak. Most men arrive somewhere around the middle of that peak. And there's a little bit of overlap, which we call intersex people. Women can have broad shoulders, men can have narrow shoulders, women can have wide hips, men can have narrow hips.
Captain! Yeah?
Humans are a diverse group. Now, keep in mind, this graph is talking about strictly physical characteristics. Whether or not somebody wears a dress or what they're feeling like up here, not relevant to this graph. Based on their sex, certain people do tend to gravitate towards people tend to gravitate towards certain kinds of social presentations, but that might not even necessarily be because they want to. Some men are more feminine, some women are more masculine, intersex people can present all kinds of ways. There's 7 billion people. And by the way, by population, there are more intersex people in the United States than there are redheads. By percentage, it's roughly 128 million people worldwide, which is more than the population of France and the UK combined. So sex isn't exactly binary. It's bimodal, because a binary suggests that there's only 2 options, of which there are clearly more. There's infinite points along a spectrum. But most of the population either has a bacon bazooka or a see you next Tuesday, so that has to be the determiner, right? Even if we're going to ignore the fact that not all cis men and women have their gonads intact due to freak accidents, medical conditions, or war, it seems kind of arbitrary to take a single physical attribute of somebody and dedicate their entire personality to that. Even things like testosterone and estrogen can vary widely. Some cis women have higher testosterone levels than men and vice versa for estrogen. So while it is true that you can't change your sex and that you can't physically change your DNA and cell structure, nobody's really claiming that, and sex is honestly kind of arbitrary too. There's an infinite amount of points along that spectrum. And you might be saying that not all trans people are intersex. Most humans have XX and XY chromosomes, except there's way more. Like, way more. About 75 million men walk the earth with Klinefelter syndrome, which means that they have 2 or more X chromosomes. They do have penises, but they also have 2 or more X chromosomes. So why do we call them men? There's also Swyer syndrome, which is where women that have female productive organs can also have Y chromosomes. Dave also brings this up.
Gender is a fact. This is a fact. Every human being in this room, every human being on earth had to pass through the legs of a woman to be on earth. That is a fact.
But not all women can give birth. And I'm not even talking about older women that have a hysterectomy. I'm talking about younger women that either had to have it removed due to health conditions or are born without a uterus at all. Some people born with vaginas don't have periods. I'm not even just talking about women past menopause. I'm talking about women that are born with the inability to menstruate. The thing is, if you're going to construct entire gender roles off of one physical attribute of somebody, why choose the genitalia? What I'm saying right now might feel kind of upsetting. A lot of people have had to fight to be socially accepted into their respective gender roles. Men are pushed to do some insane social rites of passage, and they often have to repress emotions. Women face constant discrimination and fear for their lives just for walking down the street at night. It's just like how with racism, just because race is a social construct, that doesn't mean that racism doesn't affect people today. Dave made it seem like that trans people are trying to overshadow the black community.
I said, how much do I have to participate in your self-image? I said, you shouldn't discuss this in front of black people. I said, I know niggas in Brooklyn that wear high heels just to feel safe. I asked you, why is it easier for Bruce Jenner to change his gender than it is for Cassius Clay to change his name?
In fact, this was the last joke he said to close out the set.
All I ask from your community, with all humility, will you please stop punching down on my people?
Which is problematic in that there are also black trans people. I mean, maybe this is the case for some assholes on Twitter, but last year we had the largest civil rights movement in American history for Black Lives Matter. And that's great. It's an important issue, and it should have happened. I'm saying this because I want to be very clear. I do not want to play the Oppression Olympics today. Comparing one bad thing to another bad thing does not help either side. It's not like we can't focus on 2 things at the same time. I'm not here today to tell you that just because something is a social construct that it doesn't affect you. What I'm trying to tell you is that it doesn't have to. Dave mentions Caitlyn Jenner in every single one of the specials that he's done on Netflix. Caitlyn Jenner, if you don't know, used to be an athlete named Bruce Jenner that transitioned to female. Caitlyn Jenner was named Woman of the Year by Glamour magazine in 2015. Honestly, I easily understand why this is so upsetting. However, Caitlyn Jenner is worth $100 million, is related to multiple billionaires, and travels in a private jet. Do you honestly believe that Glamour magazine gives a single polish about trans rights? Less than half of Americans have been polled as saying that they would be comfortable with having a trans child, and only 62% said that they would be comfortable with having a trans friend. Because I'll tell you one thing that this controversy brings: a metric buttload of clicks. It brought so much controversy that Dave Chappelle mentioned it in all 3 of his Netflix specials, one of which was 6 years later. Caitlyn Jenner never has to worry about this. She owns multiple houses, she can pay for bodyguards, she travels in a private jet. She's fine. Even if you believe that Caitlyn Jenner did it for attention, what about the rest of America? Imagine losing 38% of your friends and family. Imagine your identity being up for debate. A study at the University of Sussex showed that trans people are much more likely to receive verbal and physical abuse, even compared to their LGBT counterparts. There's a frequent attitude I see that trans women are trying to trick straight men into having sex with them, hence the nickname trap. Trans people have frequently reported partners becoming aggressive or even violent after they reveal this fact. This moment can literally be dangerous for trans people. And I'm not going to deny that I'm sure it does happen, but it's certainly not as common as people are making it out to be. Rhetoric like this is why legislation that prevents trans people from getting service in their respective facilities can be so dangerous. In this special, Dave did do a joke about the North Carolina bathroom bill. And notice I call it a joke because it was a joke and it was really funny.
Now I'm standing at the urinal taking a leak. And this is what this law is gonna do. A woman walks into the men's room, and then she stands shoulder to shoulder with me at the urinal. I'm like, bitch, what's going on with you? And then she hikes her skirt up and pulls a real live meaty dick out. And what do you think I'm gonna say? Thank God she's in here with me. At least now I know my family's safe.
It's a ridiculous bill based on the premise that trans women are predators, and I appreciate that Dave recognizes that flaw. And to those of you who are watching and might disagree with Dave on the bathroom bill, what exactly is stopping men from assaulting women in the bathroom anyway? Women get assaulted in the workplace openly, and men don't even see repercussions for it. Women are assaulted in bathrooms by men that had to do none of the work to change their gender. By the way, it is worth noting that legally changing your gender is super difficult. It can take more than a year, and it requires evidence that you've gone through cross-sex hormonal therapy. Some states can require gender reassignment surgery, which can cost tens of thousands of dollars, and in most cases it's not even covered by health insurance. And all of this for what? So some guy who gets caught molesting a woman in a bathroom can look at the police and be like, no, guys, don't worry. My ID says I'm a woman. Dave Chappelle may see the flaw in the bathroom bill, but if you genuinely believe that trans women are just men cosplaying women, then what are Dave's opinions on prisons and women's shelters? Trans women are 13 times more likely to get assaulted in a male prison. A lot of what he said is obviously not a joke.
TERF is an acronym. Stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist. I'm Team TERF. I agree, man. Gender is a fact.
If you think that this is just a joke, let me ask you this. What is the joke saying? Is it that he thinks that the TERF position is ridiculous? Is it that he ironically is agreeing with them to mock the notion of being a TERF? Let's not mince words. Dave is taking a very explicit stance. I am aware of the petition to take down The Closer on Netflix. The petition at the time of writing this video only has 9,000 signatures, and even if it gets 10,000 more, Netflix has 38 million users. The Closer is drawing an audience from the press that it's getting, and I'm willing to bet that half of these people don't even have a Netflix subscription, and the other half won't even cancel their subscription anyway. Just because it gets negative press does not mean that it's going to negatively affect their bottom line. Some of you may be familiar with a guy named Jordan Peterson, who back in 2016 kicked up quite a fuss about a bill that was being passed in Canada called Bill C-16. Bill C-16 is a single-page bill. What this bill would do is simply add gender identity to the list of protected classes federally in Canada. It's worth mentioning that gender identity was already a protected class in 3 Canadian provinces prior to Bill C-16. Jordan Peterson, however, claimed that the bill was going to restrict free speech, meaning that it would compel you to call people a certain pronoun. Even if you accidentally misgender them, you might be fined or imprisoned for it. Jordan Peterson has a PhD, and I'm just some guy. I'm going to use the words of a group of people that have PhDs and master's degrees known as the Canadian Bar Association. They released an entire paper outlining the bill and said, quote, "The amendment to the CRHA will not compel the speech of private citizens, nor will it hamper the evolution of academic debates about sex and gender, race and ethnicity, nature and culture, and other genuine and continuing inquiries that mark our common quest for understanding of the human condition." You may have heard of a story about a man that was fined 55,000 Canadian dollars for misgendering a trans woman. What they conveniently omit from this is that he actually started a harassment campaign, posting thousands of flyers around the city, doxing her personal information, claiming that she was a sexual predator. He also wasn't arrested under Bill C-16 because campaign harassments were already illegal in Canada. One viewpoint I want to go over, because this is something I used to believe myself, is that gender dysphoria is a mental condition with an incredibly high suicide rate, and the best option for them is not to feed the delusion, so to speak, but to put them in therapy so they can feel more comfortable in their own skin.
The transgender question is complex and difficult, and for example, Johns Hopkins doesn't do the surgeries anymore. The guy who used to run it there is a very outspoken critic of transition surgeries. It's not the best treatment pathway. They all end up killing themselves anyway. There's, by most metrics, no improvement in suicide rates. My view on this is, we're probably going to look back in 30 years and wonder how we could ever have been so cruel as to allow somebody with a psychiatric delusion to start hacking at themselves to make reality conform to their own delusions.
People suffering from gender dysphoria, which, in its non-politicized definition, means the persistent belief that you're a member of the opposite sex, have a tragically high suicidal ideation and depression rate. That suicidal ideation rate remains tragically high after surgical and hormonal treatment. Longitudinal studies that are good just do not exist on the efficacy of these measures. And the mental health problems associated with gender dysphoria remain extremely damaging, even in particularly accepting society.
The statistics on this are constantly misrepresented. There was a study that indicated 42% of individuals who were trans in their teenage years had attempted suicide. For some reason, people have extrapolated that 42% of trans individuals commit suicide. But the problem is that this study only talks about the ages of 11 to 19 years old, which teenagers already have a higher suicidality, and that also doesn't account for whether or not they were pre or post transition. A multitude of studies indicate that gender affirming therapy lowers suicidality substantially. Cornell University did a meta-analysis of 55 different studies, and of those 55, 51 of them found that transition actually improved well-being. The last thing I want to talk about, which was addressed in the aforementioned analysis, was transition regret. 60 Minutes recently aired an entire segment just on trans people that wanted to transition back after transitioning. This is only an estimated 0.3 to 3.8% of all trans people that transition. Most of them only wanted to detransition because of the discrimination they received afterwards, not because of the transition itself. Using this as a representation of the trans community is deceptively misleading. In this special, and others, Dave frequently talks about the fact that he's been canceled.
If you do anything wrong in your life, and I find out about it, I'm gonna try to take everything away from you. That's you. That's what the audience sounds like to me.
Even though the media frames this that it's me versus that community, it's not what it is. Do not blame the LGBTQ community for any of this shit. This has nothing to do with them. It's about corporate interests and what I can say and what I cannot say.
They canceled J.K. Rowling, my God. And they canceled her because she said in an interview, and this is not exactly what she said, but effectually, she said gender was a fact.
This is not what happened. J.K. Rowling defended a woman on Twitter named Maya Forstater, who was a researcher that was allegedly fired for saying that she disagrees with trans identities. Except she wasn't fired. She simply didn't have her contract renewed since she was a temporary consultant. Maya claimed that in a professional setting she would respect gender identities, but the thing is that she was on Twitter saying that one of her coworkers who identified as gender fluid was simply a man who was wearing a dress part-time. Maya also said that she was being fired for saying that you can't change your sex, which is true, but nobody's claiming that you can change your sex, they're claiming to change their gender. If you want to know more about the whole J.K. Rowling situation, I highly recommend a video by ContraPoints that I'm going to link in the description. I know some people watching this have an impression that cancel culture is a real problem in our current society. I want you to just forget about all that for a second and just genuinely ask yourself, What has Dave Chappelle lost from this? He just got paid $20 million to do this special on Netflix. He's still loved by his fans. He has an estimated net worth of $50 million. Even if he has lost work because of the trans jokes that he's made, he's still got paid $20 million to make more. Netflix even suspended 2 transgender employees for criticizing the special on Twitter. They claim that it wasn't because of the criticism that they got suspended, but seems a little bit too convenient. I am kind of bothered by somebody who's making $20 million off of a special talking about how they're losing work because of this, and then somebody who criticizes him got suspended from their job. You know what the craziest part is? Dave Chappelle has actually been canceled before. He actually had to move to South Africa and gave up $50 million and was away from the industry for over a decade. Dave Chappelle is not being canceled, he's being criticized. And unfortunately, that comes with some harassment from people who don't know how to play nice. At the end of the special, Dave tells a story of one of his friends who is a trans woman comedian. Dave continues to say that Daphne wrote a tweet defending his jokes in his original specials, which you can read right here. I have no doubt that Daphne was horribly harassed on Twitter. To Daphne, this was the very community that validated her identity. Dave says that she probably had mental troubles leading up to this, and unfortunately, this pushed her to take her own life. The creator I mentioned earlier, with the video about J.K. Rowling, ContraPoints, talks about her experience of being canceled for simply associating with somebody that the trans community actively rejects. The trans community is, let's face it, often traumatized individuals who lash out because they've always had to be on the defense. At the end of the special, Dave makes this joke.
But I'll tell that little girl, young lady, I knew your father. And he was a wonderful woman.
Based on his framework of gender being a fact, to Dave, this is just a joke. I want to contrast this with another joke.
And she grabbed me real tight, hugged me, squeezed me, and I pushed her off violently because I'm transphobic. I said, boundaries, bitch!
The joke isn't funny because he's actually transphobic, it's because he's mocking the idea that having personal boundaries is transphobic to a trans person. The other joke's purpose, the one about Daphne being a father, is to invalidate Daphne's identity. Being openly trans is a really tough thing. For a lot of people, they treat you like an alien. Some people treat you like a child that needs to be coddled. For some people, your identity is completely up for debate. I have a feeling that to be accepted in this community, Daphne kind of had to play along with a lot of people who rejected her identity. And I don't say this to make Daphne sound weak, because if anything, it actually shows strength. And keep in mind, people can do this without even realizing it. There is a possibility that I will incorrectly diagnose this, but honestly, this reeks of internalized transphobia. Imagine a black person laughing at a joke about how black people are inherently less intelligent than white people. They might have found the joke genuinely funny, but think about the implication. He believes that she was a man cosplaying a woman. And while he may respect her pronouns, he did say openly,
I'm Team Turf. I agree.
This story very much reeks of the I'm not racist, I have a black friend trope. I'm not saying that you can't find this joke funny. It's Dave Chappelle. He's a comedy legend. Knowing all the things in this video, I hope that you can at least see why the trans community is so upset. To end this video, you're probably wondering why I care so much. This is the part of the video that is going to shock my friends and family the most, because I am transgender. Soon, I will begin my transition to the person I feel I am. There's going to be an odd phase, because hormonal therapy takes a long time. People are not going to know what to do with my identity. Unfortunately, that's probably going to attract attention from the wrong people. I truly am terrified. Seeing my comedy idol tell me that my transition is essentially just an elaborate cosplay, it hurt. And you may not care if it hurts my feelings. And that's okay. I don't hate you for not caring about that. Dave Chappelle may not want to hurt trans people. Just like a white person saying that black people inherently having a lower IQ may not be trying to hurt black people. They both think that they're just stating a fact. The point is that this language isn't just harmful, it's that it empowers people who do want to hurt me. People who believe that I'm transitioning for predatory gain. People who will look at a guy like Dave Chappelle and think, well, he agrees with me and he's Dave Chappelle. The other day, I was listening to a compilation of stories from a podcast that I won't name, because I don't want to bring them any sort of harassment. But in this podcast, they talked about a story of how they traveled to Japan and hired a hooker off the street, and upon getting back to her place, realized that she was in fact transgender. And when they discovered this, they said, and I quote, they beat the hell out of her. The next day, that same person that beat the hell out of her came back and decided to hire her for sex. Now, I want you to imagine that you just got violently beaten by this same person the previous night. He knows where you live. Are you going to say no? Or the better question is, can you say no? He raped her. And this story was relatively early on in the video. So I thought to myself, there's no way that nobody will say anything. So I looked in the comments section. There was no bad dislike ratio. It was majority likes. And I couldn't find a single comment. Not one. This video has over 500,000 views. And I couldn't find a single comment. So I guess what I'm really trying to do with this is just at least help people understand. And more ambitiously, try to make the world that I'm about to live in a little bit safer to live. Transgender? I hardly know her.